You kind of alluded to it, Lisa, and you talk about at the beginning of the book about how we all paint these pictures of what life is supposed to be like and these ideas. And we put expectations on people that are sometimes not justified or not fair. Explain the picture that you had painted and thought that you were going to live.
Yeah, well, I always felt like that if you do all the right things, life should be as tidy as a math equation, and I think maybe in the Christian world especially, we feel this way, but it's like in my marriage, I felt like, okay, if we pray together and we go to church together, we do small groups together, and we go to the conferences, and we go on date nights, like we do all, like check all the boxes, then 2 + 2 should equal 4. And that's just not the way it always works, And so what was especially painful about our situation is that we are public people. And so this story was going to come out. If I didn't post that blog, the story was going to come out through the rumor mill. It was already happening because we're just more recognizable. And so, it was even the unraveling, I felt like should go a certain way, but was completely out of my control. And so, yeah, the whole thing was just hard. And I think all of us have an expectation of perfection, that if we follow along all the guidelines and rules, that this perfect reality should be ours. But perfection can never be ours on this side of eternity. We can do everything that we know to do, but the outcomes have to be placed in God's hands, because we'll face things we never thought we would face.
You talk about perfection in the book and the link to Adam and Eve, which I thought was fascinating, because you always hear that, the reason why we expect our lives to be perfect is because we watch all the TV shows and all the movies, and Brad Pitt always gets the girl, and whatever always happens. It always gets ended with a nice, neat bow, and everybody's happy. But you actually tie it back to the Garden of Eden. Explain this, because I thought it was fascinating.
Well, the human heart was created in the perfection of the Garden of Eden. But in Genesis 3, when sin enters in because of a choice that Eve and Adam made, sin enters in, and then because they then have to leave the perfection of the Garden of Eden, and we find out why at the end of Genesis 3, God makes it very clear there were 2 trees in the garden. One, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which they were never supposed to eat from. There's also the tree of life, which perpetuated them in an eternal state. So they had to be ushered out of the garden once they introduced sin. So now their body is in a state of decay, and their sin has caused a separation even between them and God. And so they must not be allowed to stay in the garden, or they would eat from the tree of life and be perpetuated for all of eternity. So it was God's mercy that He ushered them out of the garden, but He did not strip from them the awareness of perfection. So they leave the perfection of the Garden of Eden, and they enter into a world where nothing is perfect. And so the human heart today, we still have the awareness of perfection. We know it exists, but short of our relationship with God, we'll never find it. But boy, do we try to chase it, right? And we put so much pressure on relationships and so many expectations on situations and circumstances that perfection and perfectionism is very common, and it's very complicated. And this isn't God's act of cruelty. Like, why didn't He strip away from us that feeling of knowing perfection exists, but we can't find it? It's not God's way of constantly disappointing us. It's His way of leading us home. Because if lesser loves ever satisfied us in that deep, perfect way, we would have no desire for God. So it's actually a gift that God left this desire inside of us for perfection, because He's the perfect match.